My name is Angie, and this is a story I wasn't supposed to find.
And I'm her sister, Cindy. We grew up hearing almost nothing about our great-grandmother. Just a name, Stella Smith. No photos, no grave, just a blank space in the family story.
We knew a little about her, like she was married in Springfield, Illinois in 1925. She had 2 daughters that she gave up for adoption through the Illinois Home and Aid Society, and then absolutely nothing. Nothing before 1925 and nothing after giving up her children in 1930.
We had no idea what happened to her, where she went, or even if she was alive for long after that. She was just missing, and she stayed missing for over 90 years until a DNA test cracked the case wide open.
This is Buried Threads, a podcast about family secrets, silence, reinvention, and what happens when lost stories begin to resurface.
In our last episode, we discussed our search for Stella Smith, who seemed to appear from nowhere, got married to Christopher DeBoard, had 2 daughters, Florence and Marie Christine, and then virtually vanished again around 1932. A DNA match named Paul reached out and connected what we knew about Stella Smith with his missing family member, Estrella Suarez, and we realized they were the same person. Estrella married Emilio Valdez and had a daughter, Mary Rose, and then vanished without a trace.
Once we were able to connect Estrella Suarez Valdez with Stella Smith DeBoard, we had some clues as to where Stella or Estrella came from.
We ended our last episode wondering about what shaped this woman who left 2 families behind. Are there any clues in her childhood which may help us understand why she would leave her children, change her name, and start over? Maybe uncovering more about her family of origin will help us better know Estrella herself.
Let's dig into what we found about her and the questions that still remain. Today, we're going to go back even further in time. Before the DNA surprises, before the adoptions and the disappearances, there was a man named Manuel Suarez, and there was a woman who changed his life, Rosa.
It's easy to think of genealogy as documents and dates and databases, but this story, it's a love story. And like many love stories, it began in grief.
So Manuel Suarez came to America sometime around 1905 or 1906 from Spain by way of Cuba. Like many immigrants, he came in search of work. During this time period, the Spanish Civil War had just finished. The country of Spain was in unrest, and there was not work to be found. And so many people were finding their way to America, and many were being recruited specifically for their skills in the mining industry. And so mining companies would offer to pay their way and get them over here and get them jobs. Many of them expecting they would just come work for a while and send money home or eventually return, but then many choosing to stay and bring the rest of their family here. And that's exactly the life that Manuel was part of. He worked in the zinc mines, first in West Virginia and then in Kansas.
In Kansas, Manuel met a woman named Concepcion Bahaga, and they married in 1910. And shortly after, Concepcion gave birth to a daughter, Luisa, in 1911.
Tragedy came quickly as life in the Midwest could be tough. Among many other dangers, there were often outbreaks of typhoid due to contaminated water sources and other risks. Unfortunately, Concepcion became ill with typhoid fever. We found a newspaper article that detailed her request to leave the hospital once she realized that she would not recover so that she could die at home surrounded by her husband and her child. She passed away the next day on August 31st, 1912.
It's a heartbreaking story. And you can imagine Manuel, he's a young working man, now widowed, and a single father to a baby girl. And not just working, but working in the mines.
Right.
So maybe a distance away, definitely long days,
hours, yeah.
Hard work. Yeah. And it was very common, or it would have been very common in situations like this to ask family members for help. It's common today, right? So we believe that's what Manuel did. We believe that he wrote home, maybe to Spain or to family somewhere, asking for someone to send help.
And the answer came with the arrival of Rosa, who is in his nuclear family community in Spain. And she came over not to be his wife, but just to help with Luisa and to help run the home. And from the best that we can tell, Estrella arrived from Spain a short time later. We've not been able to find any specific documentation about their arrival. I've not been able to find the manifest showing their arrival. The only documents I have that detail the time frame that they might have come over is in the 1920 census. there are several questions for those who are not citizens. And one of the questions is, what year did you immigrate? And in that case, it said that Rosa came in 1912 and Estrella in 1913. Again, those aren't specific proven dates because it's not connected to a manifest. It's based on a memory. But I think one of the most important things to note is they didn't come together, that they came at separate times.
So at first, it seemed Manuel Suarez was Estrella Suarez's father. And actually, that's what the family believed forever.
She was raised as his child.
She was raised as his child. They share a name. She was sent from Spain, lived with him in a relatively young age. And so after seeing the DNA results, you changed your mind about that. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I don't want to go yet into too much detail, the nitty gritty about DNA, but in general, their DNA matched. There were DNA matches from Manuel's family, his children and his grandchildren that did match to my mom, who descended from Estrella. However, those matches weren't what you would expect. And the family also didn't really do a lot of historical genealogy on what happened, who made up part of Manuel's family prior to coming to America. They didn't really have on the documented trees like who his parents were and his grandparents were and his siblings. But I was able to do, through this DNA project, I was able to match up descendants and follow them up the tree and link several siblings together, many siblings together, and be able to build a picture of what that family looked like. And some of those siblings settled in the Detroit area, and some of them settled in Gary, Indiana, and some of them settled in the New Jersey area. And then each building their family in those. And so what that showed me is that all the DNA matches in those different lines were equal distance to my mom as the ones who were also in Manuel's line, and if she was Manuel's child, Estrella, which would make my mom of Manuel's line, you would expect those DNA matches to be much closer than they were. Yeah. So because they were the same as all the others, it led me to believe that they're definitely related, definitely part of the family, but more likely that she was his niece, that like a sibling of Manuel was Estrella's parents. And that's how they were DNA related with all the other siblings, but not that he was not her father.
And regardless of, well, even for a more distant relative, not a child, it wouldn't have been unusual for families to send their children to help other family members in situations like this, like we said. And it might even be more likely, depending on a child's family life, if a child had been orphaned or lacked opportunities, like you talked about the situation in Spain, which may have impacted a decision, or if her family planned to make the trip to the U.S., they might have sent her ahead to be helpful to Manuel, but planning to join.
So, again, without going into all of the nuts and bolts of the DNA specific research at this point, we'll go into that later. I have been able to identify with certainty the names of the grandparents, and that was done by matching up the DNA matches of all the different siblings that converge on the same people. And so I know with certainty who the grandparents are.
Estrella's grandparents. On the maternal side, the grandfather's name was Jose Suarez Fernandez, and the grandmother's name was Felisa Garcia de Campa. And they had many children, one of whom was Manuel, and many others that could give clues as to who would be the parent of Estrella. The second set of grandparents are Jose Martinez and Josefa Garcia. And Martinez is kind of the family name that as they descended down that they stuck with. And so interestingly enough, there happens to be a Martinez daughter that married a Suarez son. Oh, imagine that.
Yes, and they had 10 children together.
Oh, wow.
And they are all pretty well stair-step. And if you look at all 10 of the children and when the birthdays are, there's a couple of interesting things. The first thing you notice is there's a hole right in the place where Estrella will be born. And if that was her, she would have been the oldest daughter. There would have been a son, 2 sons older than her. But she would have been the oldest daughter. And then there would have been younger siblings. So in May of 1913, something really interesting happens. We don't know, again, exactly when Estrella came over, but we know that it was in 1913, according to that census. In May of 1913, there is a ship manifest that I have a copy of that shows the mom, Consuelo, and all of the children that were born, all 10 of them weren't born yet. Some of them were born in the United States,
Sure.
but the ones that were born, there are about 6 of them, I believe. They're all listed on that manifest, by name, traveling from Spain to the United States. On their manifest, they had to declare where their final stop was going to be. And guess where the final stop was going to be?
Where's that?
In St. Louis.
Ah, okay.
Not only that.
Where Manuel was.
Where Manuel and Rosa were living.
And Estrella and Luisa.
Yes, they were all living there, right? I should say Manuel was living in Southern Illinois at the
working,
mine,
but
and supporting the family. But
Luisa, and Estrella.
Yes. And the address that they moved to was blocks away from the address where Rosa was living with the 2 girls. So they all came over. And in addition to being Consuelo and all the kids, note that father wasn't there, Consuelo and all the kids, also Consuelo's mom and dad and her siblings that were still minors that were living in their home. They all came over together and they all immigrated to St. Louis in the exact same neighborhood, blocks away from where Rosa was with the girls. And so I think that really points to some geographic considerations that, what are the chances of something like that happen? That really does point not only that she wasn't being sent away from the family, she was sent ahead of the family, and the family also came and they kind of lived in community together.
Now, you didn't mention when her dad came over.
I've never found a record of when dad came over. My theory is that he is the one that came with Estrella. She'd been too young to go on
to
a trip
travel
like
by
that.
herself.
Right.
Yeah.
So my theory is that he brought her over ahead and that they were already here. And then the family followed.
Okay, so just speculating, right? Total made up whatever. It's possible that he came over with Estrella. She helped Rosa with the baby, Luisa. And also maybe he was working to set up a house for his family coming, which then being in similar field, right?
He actually was, a skilled civil engineer.
Oh, okay.
So he still did have to establish, where his work was going to be here.
Well, and maybe a similar issue to Manuel. Maybe he wouldn't have been able to have Estrella in the home with him while he's working to set up, preparing for his family to come. Yeah. So that's not unreasonable.
Right.
Although we don't have any of that confirmed. That's just conjecture. But you could see how that would be possible. Yeah. It's a little more palatable to me than like an 8-year-old coming over by herself and being sent away.
Right.
Yeah.
I don't think she was sent away. I think she was sent ahead.
Yeah.
And again, in communities like this, they lived in a broader community than just the mom, household, dad, and 3 kids living in a home,
Yeah. That does make a lot of sense. And also, we can talk more about what happens in the future, but she does end up staying with Manuel and Rosa, but maybe that was a choice of hers. Yeah. Having grown up in this household for a while, maybe she wanted to stay with them and travel with them.
We don't know anything about
that. We don't know. That would be a guess. So, and then that comes back to where we kind of started with that conversation, that we don't know exactly when Rosa or Estrella arrived, other than the years they shared. Yeah. On a census, which again, census is official record, but it's based, that information is just whatever whoever's doing the census tells them.
Right. They didn't have to produce any proof of that. They were able to
just say it. Right. So the other thing that we do have record of, just to validate some of the timing and placement of everything, is that Manuel and Rosa applied for a marriage license in 1915 or around 1915, I think. And that application was made in St. Louis. And that on that application, Manuel listed his home address as being in Southern Illinois, which is where he was working and we believe sending money, back to Rosa, who her address was there in St. Louis. So likely, we know
blocks away from where
blocks away from where the others came. So surely she was there with Luisa, and then of course later Estrella, caring for them, life there, and then Manuel joined her and they got married.
Yeah.
And then after they got married, that's when they moved to Taylor Springs, Illinois, which is central Illinois, not actually very far from St. Louis on the Illinois side. So that is where Estrella shows up on the 1920 census as a child living in their home. Correct?
Yes.
And in that census.
And the only document I see, the only official legal document I've ever found Estrella's name on until the birth of her daughter.
And that's where she's listed as Estrella, which, well, we'll talk about, the other birth record. So in that census, that's where Rosa says that she arrived in the U.S. in 1912 and that Estrella came in 1913.
Yes.
So that's places them geographically. When that census happened in 1920, they were living together. Manuel and Rosa were married, and they all lived together in Taylor Springs, Illinois, which is not far from St. Louis.
Right. Also note that the family that immigrated also to St. Louis, they stayed there for a couple of years, but then they eventually moved to New York. Not sure what year they moved there, and that's where he moved there for work. And so it's possible that's also why she chose to stay, is maybe she didn't want to go to New York. Maybe, I mean, that's just speculation, but maybe she wanted to stay.
She was established. So then life in Taylor Springs, Manuel, Rosa, Estrella, and Luisa, they're together as a family unit. They moved to Taylor Springs and set up home.
Yeah. Well, the kids weren't actually born yet. So they moved there with just Luisa and Estrella and Rosa and Manuel, moved to Taylor Springs, and then their family began there and their kids were born either in Taylor Springs. They moved in the early years, a couple of different places right around there, Beckenheimer and also Hillsborough, before then eventually landing in Sandoval. And Sandoval's where was their final place that they, established. And that's where all the kids, the 4 following kids were born.
And the name of the 4 kids?
Jose, Nina, Luisa, and Marianne. And again, I want to point out there's 2 Luisas. There's the Luisa that was born, the older child, and then there was another Luisa born later. I did confirm with the family. I wanted to make sure that wasn't like a typographical error of any kind. There were 2 Luisas in the family.
The first Luisa is the child born of Manuel and Concepcion.
Yes.
And the second Luisa is born of Manuel and Rosa.
Yes. And the names were spelled slightly different. So the oldest Luisa was Louisa. The younger one was Luisa. No extra O in there. So anyways.
And both would have been Suarez.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. There is something else I should say about Estrella's early years that stands out. When she later described her upbringing to the adoption agency, she cast it as kind of a Cinderella story, but without the Prince Charming and happy ending, right? I mean, from her perspective.
Right. So I want to just talk a little bit about that synopsis and what was said in there and then kind of my thoughts on it. So I had that synopsis very early on, like when I first started looking back 25 years ago. Can you believe that? And when I first read that, I took every word of that as gospel truth and tried to investigate and ferret out all the details and could substantiate almost nothing in there. Then when I found out who she really was, I kind of dismissed it all and thought, well, this is all a bunch of lies, and dismissed it completely. But as the research has continued and we've learned, there are threads of truth woven in there. And so it's really hard to discern what in it is true, what is false, what is manufactured, what is mistaken, and how the changes got made.
And what even was what she would have been known as Stella at the time, what even was her and maybe what somebody else heard and wrote down.
So this was written by a social worker giving a synopsis of the family situation. And even if Estrella was telling the situation exactly how it was, it's a complicated family story as far as who her parents were, who her siblings were, how she came to be here, and how she lived. So let's just assume for a moment that she said everything 100% truthful. The caseworker could have made the choice to simplify it and streamline the information for the purpose of sanitizing. Because in those days, adoptions were very closed. You weren't supposed to ever find out any details, or just because it was complicated.
Or even if they heard it differently.
Right.
Yeah.
Or it could also be that she had a skewed perception of it. But here's what the summary said. The summary stated that it was her father, her mother, her and her sister, and her mother died while her sister was a baby. And then after her mother died, didn't distinguish that there were different mothers for the different girls. After her mother died, that her father put her in the care of a family, a woman in St. Louis. And they lived in a boarding house in St. Louis, and that the father was off working and would send money back to support them. And that went on for a little while. And then that his father remarried, didn't state that he was remarrying the person that was caring for her, right? But then that the father remarried, and that once they remarried, that the stepmother the exact quote was, put her out to work at a young age. Now, again, I took that initially as like made her get a job. I didn't know exactly what that was referencing. But I think that, again, understanding the bigger context of the family, I think it was really referencing just that expectation of help. And I think it really defines this murky role that she had in the family. She was thought of and loved as a child of the family, but there was also an expectation that she was there to help in a different way than maybe the other siblings there to help. Plus, she was much older, and with an age gap, there's always that feeling that you have responsibilities that maybe the younger kids don't have. But either way, it appears that her perspective was that she was unsure of how she fit into the family, whether she was a member of the family as a child or whether she's a member of the family as a help. And so, that may explain some of the complicated family dynamics that existed for her.
I mean, we had talked earlier, you're a firstborn child in our family, and I think of my own firstborn child, and I think one thing in common that a lot, not all maybe, but a lot of firstborn children would say that they had a lot of responsibilities for younger siblings.
And the babies of the family didn't have to do anything.
I don't know what you're talking about. But let's not even talk about the middle child.
Right.
Okay? But for sure, that is a real thing. Like it's a valid thing, where even if not put on by a parent, the oldest siblings, the firstborn, often feel responsibility to help care for the younger ones, whether intentional or not. So some of that could be that perspective. But even as you were telling the story, I'm thinking about the threads of truth that run through it. And, let's say she was around 8 years old when she came, whether she came with her father or not, staying with another family, whether she chose to stay with the family or not. I could see how a child could be very confused about what their role in the family would be, knowing that these aren't her birth parents, that this isn't her birth family. I imagine living that close, she probably had relationship with her actual siblings, but we don't know that, So maybe it was really confusing for her to just really know where she fit in the world and to understand her own identity just because of this bigger sort of complex family dynamic.
Yeah, I also think it's interesting to think about the way immigrant families assimilate to culture, to a new culture, whatever that culture might be.
Yeah.
It's not linear. It's not equal for everyone. And this is common with lots of different families that immigrate from different places. But typically the husband is out working. And so he's interacting in the culture of the community that he's living in at a greater level than maybe his wife, who's at home caring for the family in the house.
Yeah.
She usually is slower to learn the language, slower to learn the culture. And then the kids usually learn at a rapid fire pace because, kids learn at a faster rate anyways, but also they're going to school and having those interactions. Yeah. And so when I read the 1920 census, one of the things that jumped out at me, one of the questions it asks in there is if they speak English, and it goes down the whole list of the family. And the only person in the family who did not speak English listed was Rosa. And so that kind of points to that same, thing that she was not maybe keeping up with how everybody else is assimilating in the family. And then the other thing I noticed is that Estrella was a student because it asked the question if she was in school. So at that time, when she was like 15 on that census, she was attending school, which also lends credence that she was interacting as a child of the household.
Sure.
Not only help for the family.
Yeah.
But then you think about, she would have been then much older than the other kids, and she also would have been assimilating at a much more rapid pace than maybe Rosa was, which might explain some of the tensions that were there.
Sure. Well, whatever it was about her early childhood, we don't know the details, but whatever it was, it clearly shaped her. And interestingly, when asked about siblings, and we may have said this before, when she was giving the narrative to the adoption agency, the only sibling that she referred to was Luisa.
Right.
She said she had one sibling. She didn't mention the other children of Manuel and Rosa, even though she would have grown up in the household they would have been born while she was living in that household. She didn't refer to them as half siblings or siblings at all. And then, of course, this other family, her birth family, she didn't refer to them either. And that might speak to some of her feeling displaced. The person that was probably the sibling figure who was probably the longest in her life and the most constant would have been Luisa. Yeah. So maybe that helps give some of that picture.
Well, I think it kind of speaks to that. Even if, she was fully embraced as a child member of the family, which by all accounts that she was, she would have not fit in fully but not fully fit in the family that she came from either. It would have really put her in this precarious place of where do I fit in and where do I belong?
Yeah. So there's a little more to say about Luisa.
Yes. So Luisa is definitely a thread worth pulling. When Estrella gave her narrative to the adoption agency, she mentioned that she had one sister, Luisa, that Luisa had married and moved to California and then died. Well, that was not true. That was
surprise.
Pretty early on proved none of that was true.
Yeah.
Luisa didn't die until the 1970s. So, that was an errant thing. And one of the reasons why I wanted to dismiss that whole narrative, because clearly this wasn't true.
Right.
But what did strike me is interesting is if you put a timeline together of all the things that are happening, by the time she was giving this information to the adoption agency, would have been long after she left her home in Taylor Springs and around the same time that Luisa was getting married. In other words, Luisa didn't get married until after Estrella left Taylor Springs. So how did she know that she got married? How did she know that she moved to California? Because those parts were true. She did get married in West Virginia. She did have a son in West Virginia, and they did move to California about the same time that she was having this conversation with the agency. How would she have known that?
So Estrella had to be in communication with Luisa or with someone who could keep her up to date on Luisa.
Yes.
And clearly they must have had a closer bond because she's the only one she refers to as family. So we just would assume that it would be Luisa directly.
Yeah.
So
I also think it's interesting, I want to mention this before we move on, that whether it was intentional or whether it was more of just a way of hiding from where she was running from. But if you think about it, every place that she ran to, she also walked away from her culture, because when she reemerged as this new person, she was not claiming her Spanish heritage. She was not claiming her Spanish name, and she wasn't keeping in contact with her Spanish community. And so, she was basically entering a different world that denied all of that relationship, all of that heritage. And I just find that interesting. Again, whether that was intentional or whether that was just more of a way of hiding from people that if she stayed connected, then they might know who she is or where she's from.
And as far as what the family believed was that Manuel and Rosa and Emilio and Mary Rose were in contact with each other after Estrella left. And we can talk more about that details later. Emilio
and Estrella lived right next door.
Right. When she left.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And so while everybody else in the family didn't know anything about Estrella didn't really know anything about her after she left. Maybe Luisa did. And that's something to chase down. And like you said, we have discovered, you found that Luisa has moved around a lot. She was in California, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, maybe not in that order. She died in San Francisco. Mm-hmm. She's buried there with near her son, Alfredo, who is in the military, and her obituary mentions 3 grandchildren.
And the way I was able to verify that particular Luisa and Alfredo, because their names are relatively common, right? Luisa Garcia was her married name.
Yeah.
That's a relatively common name. I wanted to verify that Luisa was the right one. So when Alfredo died, Alfredo was a veteran. And so he had an application for a federal or for a military headstone. And that application had to be filled out by a family member. And it was filled out by Joe Suarez, which is Manuel's son, in Sandoval, Illinois, with that address.
Oh, interesting.
He was the one that filled it out to make the application for the headstone. And then of course, he died after his mom, Luisa, but then Luisa was buried in the same cemetery that he was, also a military cemetery. So it just proved, it was able to, again, put another pin in that we know for sure this is the Luisa that's connected to this family. This is the Alfredo connected to this family.
It's not just names. Like it's much more specific than that. And then you haven't yet found or connected with Luisa's grandchildren.
I have not been able to. So unfortunately, the California Marriage Index is very public. It's easy to find, but it has no or very little information. It lists the name of the bride, the name of the groom, and the date they were married, and no other identifying information.
Pretty unhelpful.
And so, right. So I have a name of someone that I believe could be the person that he married, but I have no other extra information to validate for sure that would be the one. But if that is the person, they were married and they were divorced about 10 years later, which explains why in the obituary only the children were referenced and not a spouse.
Yeah. And then there's another DNA match from Los Angeles that is we'll talk more about later, but we can't quite figure out. We have questions.
Yes.
We have questions.
So when we were analyzing all the different matches and figuring out who belonged to who and who was connected to who, there's clustering. And so you figure out who's related to each other. And there's tools in DNA that will help you figure out, who's related to who. And these ones are connected and these are connected. And you figure how all the pieces fit together. When you look at the cluster for Estrella, it's a pretty small cluster. There's not a lot in that gene pool that have done a lot of DNA testing. So it's a much smaller number of.
Yeah, it doesn't mean there's not people. They just haven't done the testing.
It's not a high test category. And so I wish more were taken. It would make my life a whole lot easier in solving these mysteries.
You people hear that. Take the test.
But it's a relatively small cluster that are all related, again, through Estrella's side. And even of those, I've been able to separate which of those are maternal with Estrella's and which are paternal. So when you look at those, then you also look at which ones are quality matches. Once the numbers get too small, they become a little more unreliable and so far away, it's hard to place them in. So I'm looking at anything over 100, 120 centimorgans. There's another mystery DNA match. His name is Ryan. What's interesting about Ryan is, first of all, he has more centimorgans in common with my mom than Paul does, and Paul's her first cousin. Now, It's slightly more. It's not significantly more. So Paul's at about 225, Ryan's at about 245, which really says that they are about equally related. And also, Ryan is equally related to Paul is the same way he's equally related to mom. In other words, he's not more closely related to one than the other. Those three are like equally balanced.
So they're all first cousins.
Yes. And then if you look at all of the other DNA matches that are in like Manuel's family, the ones that we, again, known to be in that tight cluster, they are all related to Ryan in the same degree of separation that Paul is and the same degree of separation that my mom is. And again, if you think about it for just a minute, we know for sure Estrella had 3 children, and we know that Paul is the child of one, and my mom is the child of the third, and this particular person anchors himself in the exact same degrees of separation from all of them. And so in addition to that, the DNA results also show his Spanish ancestry, which is 25%, which is the same as Paul's and the same as my mom's, which shows that whoever Estrella had the child with, that would be his parent, was not Spanish. So then that child was 50% Spanish, and then that child, which would be Ryan, was 25% Spanish, all in very equal things.
So let me translate.
Yes.
What we're saying is Paul is a grandchild of Estrella.
Through the first daughter.
Through his first daughter. Our mother is a grandchild of Estrella through the third daughter. Second daughter didn't have any children. We know that. This person is a grandchild of an unknown child of Estrella.
There is a child after.
There is a fourth child,
and
at least.
Here's how we know that there's a fourth child. If let's just say that Mary Rose, the first child, had an unknown pregnancy, mystery thing, whatever. If that was the case, then and Ryan was the product of that line, then Ryan would show up closer in DNA to Paul than he would to my mom. If this was
like if Florence had a child we didn't find record of,
that child, then Ryan would show up closer to my mom than he would to Paul. But that's not the case. And so it has to be another line.
Another child of Estrella who is neither Paul's line or our mother's line.
Yes. Not with Christopher.
So there has to be a fourth child.
So it gets even more complicated.
Oh my gosh.
So Ryan has a tree that's fleshed out
on a genealogical website
with over 700 names on it. And I would love to be able to spend some time digging into that tree. However, he has that tree locked down private. I have sent him so many messages through that particular site, and he has not logged on that site for a long time, and he has not been able to see any of those messages. If I could,
Do you keep sending them?
I keep sending them because, Every time he receives a message in the app, he gets a notification from the app that says you received a new email. So one of these days, maybe.
And you can see that he hasn't actually even been on that website.
It tells you the last time he logged on.
So it's not like he's seeing your messages via that website.
Have never been read.
Yeah.
And he's not logged into the
so he might have just walked away from it thinking, I'm done, nothing to find here.
Exactly. And he probably doesn't even know, he may or may not know he has a mystery in his story. He may not even know.
Yeah.
Depending on what
we didn't know.
Like.
Paul's family didn't know.
Right.
I mean, we knew there was stuff we didn't know, but we didn't know that it was a whole other branch of the family.
Yes.
Yeah. Interesting. So,
Ryan, if you're out there, open your email.
Please unlock your tree, respond to your messages. Oh, goodness. Okay, so back to this idea that Estrella's early life and her bond with Luisa may hold more clues, maybe even more important than we originally realized. And Rosa, this is where we started today. Rosa, the woman who came to help and ended up raising this blended family, was kind of central to all of this.
Yeah. I really view Rosa as I think of the whole story. I think of Manuel's life before having so much pain and so much loss, so many things that happened. Even immigrating here under the best of circumstances has its own trauma and adjustment and whatever. And then, losing his wife and navigating those waters. And I'm sure during that time he was very committed to his family. He was working and sending money, but that's not family life. It's not what you expect it's going to be.
Right.
But then, when he and Rosa decided that they had a love that they wanted to develop together and begin this family together, then really life kind of began again. And then now they have a home together where they're all living under one roof and they're functioning as a family. They had additional children. I just really feel like life kind of began at that point. And really, when you talk to the family members, life did begin at that point. They really didn't know much about what was happening before. They didn't know that they ever lived in St. Louis. They never knew that until I showed documentation about that. They had never seen the marriage license between those two. They did not know that Luisa was born in Kansas. They didn't believe me. I had to prove it that she was born in Kansas. And so,
so life really literally began for this family
once they got to
Taylor Springs. And we know that they stayed there. Yeah. They stayed together. They stayed there, and the family
was formed in such an unconventional way.
Yeah,
right?
really
through hard times and through sad things, right? And Estrella came to the family in an abnormal way, and Luisa and
even Rosa,
all the things.
Yeah.
But out of that, right? They chose a love. They chose the family. They chose to care for each other, and by all accounts, lived a very happy and long life together.
Yeah. So, what are some of the questions? If we can narrow it down, what are some of the questions that we're left with this week?
There is more for us to know about Manuel and Rosa, about their backgrounds and their story in general. And Luisa, if we could connect with her grandchildren, maybe we could gain some insights into her relationship with Estrella. If Estrella had any contact with Luisa, they might, hold information about that. It's getting to the point now. Some of those firsthand people most of them are deceased. And so it becomes much more difficult, but it's possible that there are snippets or memories that have been passed down. More information about her. There might be more information about Estrella's life before marrying Emilio and that family that she came from. Interestingly, all the DNA matches in the family, none of them, not one, is from the line that relates to who I believe
Consuelo and
Jose's line, right?
Yeah, interesting.
They're siblings, on both sides.
Mm-hmm.
They're siblings, they're parents,
but not direct,
not from their children or their children's children.
So Estrella's biological siblings and nieces and nephews, we haven't made any connection.
If there was ever a test there, that would open up,
loop them in. Mm-hmm. Interesting. So next time we're going to look a little more in depth at Estrella's life from Taylor Springs to Springfield and the families that she left in both places, including our grandmother.
We'll look at what it means to reinvent yourself and what gets left behind when you do.
Thanks for listening. If you're walking your own search through DNA research, silence, or your family story, you're not alone.
If you want to learn more about our story, you can read it chapter by chapter on Substack at a blog called Buried Threads. We'd love it if you subscribed or left a review. It helps other listeners to find us. And if you've uncovered something through DNA that changed your understanding of your family, we would love to hear about it. Message us on Substack or find us on Instagram at Buried Threads.
Watch for our next episode to post right here. We'll also be dropping some documents and photos with each podcast. Let us know your questions and your comments as we go.
Until next week, keep pulling the thread.